In this video, we'll be learning how to create the form elements using the HTML markup. But before we create these form elements, there's one more thing to keep in mind, and that is any form element, be it radio button, input field, checkbox, or dropdown, all these are wrapped inside the aptly named form element. So to create either just one form element or a lot of form elements, we'll begin by typing the opening and closing form element. We begin creating form element with the help of input element. This one element is used to create several different form controls. This element has an attribute called type, which determines what type of input it will be creating. The input element is also a self-closing element. Let's start creating our first form element, and that is the input field. Let's first write the opening and closing form element, and when the value of type is equal to text, the browser displays a text field where we can enter text. Input type equals to text. Close the tag, save it and load into the browser, and we can see that the browser has created a text field where we can enter anything we want. But almost always, whenever there is an input field on any website, there is a label before it that determines what should be entered in the input field. And now that we have entered the label, it appears just before the input element. And inside the HTML, the label is written just before the opening of input element. Next, when the value of type is password, exactly similar text field is created, and we cannot differentiate whether it's a text field or a password field until we enter in the text and we see that it is being shown as bullets instead of text in order to hide it. And here we go. And to label it, just like we did with the name, we'll write password just before the opening of input element. Enter your password : save it and load into the browser, and now we can see that it has the appropriate label that lets us know what to enter in the text field. Next, the radio button. When the value of type equals to radio, the browser creates a radio button, as we can see there. But in any form on the internet, there are always a minimum of 2 radio buttons because they are used to allow users to choose one item from the available options. The best example can be selection of a gender. The options for gender can be male, female, and other. So let's create these 3 radio buttons and write their labels just like we wrote for the name and password. That is before the opening of input element. Let's first create 3 radio elements. Then let's give them a name, male. And let's create a line break as well so that all the radio buttons appear on their own line. Female : and the last value or gender can be other. Save it and load into the browser. And now we can see that we have 3 radio buttons. But when we fill out the radio button, we see that here's a problem. One can either be male, female, or other. We cannot select male and female at the same time. So in order for the browser to restrict us from selecting more than one radio button at the same time, there's an additional attribute called name. If we want only one radio button to be selectable out of these 3, we shall give the same name to all 3 radio buttons. And after saving it, we see that now we can select just one of the 3 radio buttons. None of the 2 can be selected at the same time. Next input element is the checkbox, and we create it by giving the value of type equals to . Save it and load into browser. and we see that the browser has created a checkbox. We can check and uncheck it. Let's give it a label as well. Check if you are American. Save it and load into the browser. And now we can see that it has the appropriately named label as well. And finally, there are some cases when the checkbox is already checked by default. We can achieve this by writing checked inside the input element. Save it and load, and we see that now the checkbox is checked by default. And finally, there is an input type known as submit. This creates a button inside the browser. This has an additional attribute called value as well. And first, let's see what the button look like inside the browser. It has a default label that is submit query. When we give it a value, say go, save it and load into the browser, we see that this value appears on the button as a label. This label not only appears on the button, but also the button's width is defined by the text that appears on it as a label. The wider the text, the wider the button. Alright, there are a few other types of input fields as well, but since they are a bit more advanced and our existing knowledge is insufficient to understand them, therefore we shall do them later. Right now, let's turn our attention to one more form element, but for the sake of organization, let's do that in the next video. Thanks for watching.